Welcome to day 6 of 21 days of personal development. Today's topic is being truthful with ourselves and with others and protecting ourselves. Now, when I think of those topics, the first thing that comes to my mind is vulnerability. Being truthful, especially with ourselves, can be very vulnerable. We don't always enjoy being truthful about the things in our lives that we need to acknowledge. And we are very often not very good at protecting ourselves from self-criticism and being hard on ourselves, being supportive of ourselves, being gentle with ourselves. So let's dive in. I want to start with a quote by Dr. Edith Eva Eger. I'll include the link in the description below. She's a psychologist that was in a prisoner of war camp and almost died. Her mother died, her father died, her and her sister managed to survive through it, and one of her other sisters was luckily in another country at the time, so she also survived, but only just. And she came out of that and eventually became a very renowned psychologist in America, an incredibly good one, and helped many, probably thousands of people. In her later years, she is still alive, but in her later years, and she's now, I think she was in her 80s by the time this happened, she began doing a lot of speaking. I'm not sure if she did it earlier in her life, but in her later years, she started doing a lot of speaking, and she actually wrote a book called The Choice, which is an extremely good book, and I recommend that you read it. The link will be in the description below. It's an incredibly good book. She describes her experience in the prisoner of war camps, her experience almost dying, and how she made sense of all of this in her own life, how she made sense of the fact that she lived when so many other people died. And she has some incredibly, absolutely, I think, brilliant wisdom about life and about making sense of life. Now, in her book, The Choice, she has a line that I'd like to quote for you. Change is about noticing what's no longer working and stepping out of the familiar, imprisoning patterns. Now, one of the things that I discover quite regularly with my clients is that often we get into patterns in our life and we ourselves are not terribly aware of that. When I get to know the client, I can often see the pattern, I can observe it, it repeats itself in various different ways, but it's very often something that the client themselves, they might be a little bit aware of it, but they're often not actively doing something about it or actively noticing it. And sometimes it can be very difficult for them to acknowledge that pattern in their life and acknowledge that truth about themselves. And I know in my own life, it's very difficult. When I was actually starting to look at the content for today's little chat, I was thinking, what are the truths in my own life that I struggle with? And for myself, one of the big things I struggle with is that I really do not enjoy exercise. Unfortunately, I wish I did. And I really struggle to force myself to do exercise. It's not something that I enjoy. When I'm doing it, sometimes I do enjoy it, but I never ever want to exercise ever. It's genuinely one of my biggest struggles. And if I had to look at what truth do I need to admit to myself, it would be that obviously to stay healthy, to have a healthy body, and as I'm starting to age, to go into aging, with flexibility and the best chance of living healthfully into old age, I need to exercise. I know all of that. I really do. And yet to actually admit it to myself and to admit it to the point where I'm willing to take action on it is very difficult. But we need to do that. And I know for myself that that was a difficult thing to acknowledge when I was preparing this, that for me, that's the struggle. For each person, the struggle is going to be a little bit different. So I want you to ask yourself a question. What choices are you resisting? I've shared with you the choices that I resist quite a lot with exercise. Which choices are you resisting? And then I want to put a second question to you. If not now, when? It's a bit sobering to ask ourselves those questions. This is definitely not this truthfulness topic is definitely not an easy one. Most definitely not. So if we carry on, let me just move this paper. I want you to take a look at the unhelpful limits that you're using to resist these choices. Now, these unhelpful limits take away from each of us fully becoming the remarkable people that we can be. And the four things that I would suggest we might use as unhelpful limits are fight, give up or submit, freeze, and escape. I want you to think of the choice that, or what your answer was for what are the choices that you're resisting. And I want you to try to identify, how are you resisting that? Are you fighting against it? Have you just given up? I think with exercise, sometimes I just do that, giving up one. Are you in some sort of freeze mode where you're trying to completely ignore it? Or are you trying to escape, make excuses and find ways to get out of that choice? Try to identify what you're using and acknowledge it to yourself. Owning our story can be hard, but not nearly as difficult as spending our lives running from it. That's a quote by Dr. Brené Brown. Now, when we talk about these choices that we're resisting, it's a vulnerable space to be in. And Dr. Brené Brown has she's a vulnerability expert. She's spent decades studying vulnerability, and she's an expert on it. And she writes the following: vulnerability is not winning or losing. It's having the courage to show up and be seen when we have no control of the outcome. Vulnerability is not weakness, it's our greatest measure of courage. And I think, using my example of exercise, that speaks to me a bit, because I don't have much control over the outcome, especially since I'm not going to ever take on a very aggressive exercise program. So if I start exercising, I feel very vulnerable. I know that I'm not able to do most of the moves accurately, especially when I haven't done it for quite a while and then I start again. I feel clumsy and I feel as if I'm getting it wrong. So it's vulnerable. It's a vulnerable space to be in. And I think that is one of the main things that keeps me in the given up, submit, unhelpful limit place where I don't do it. But it's important for us to realize that being vulnerable, although it feels very uncomfortable, is not actually dangerous. It's not actually something that can hurt us. Being vulnerable exposes us. It's an exposure to emotional risk. Someone might laugh at me while I'm trying to do exercises. Someone, I might do it wrong and feel stupid, but it's a feeling. And one of the things when we try and face our truth is that we need to realize that feelings, although they are very uncomfortable, they're not actually dangerous. So Brené Brown adds some very useful advice here. She says, there can be no courage without vulnerability, and vulnerability without boundaries is not vulnerability. So the 10 boundaries that we spoke about in the beginning, your desires, talents, your values, your thoughts, your behaviors, your attitudes and beliefs, your choices, your limits, your feelings, and your love, those are the 10 boundaries that you are in control of. No one else is in control of that. So if we apply our boundaries to these situations where we feel vulnerable, it gives us a measure of control. Dr. Brené Brown also advises that we ask ourselves the following 4 questions when we are sharing something, especially with new people, when we are doing something that feels vulnerable. Why am I sharing this? Or if it's something like exercise, why am I doing this? What outcome am I hoping for? What emotions am I experiencing? And what unmet needs might I be trying to meet? Very thought-provoking questions. So I encourage you to try to face up to that vulnerability feeling and take a risk and be truthful with yourself. And if there are choices that you are resisting because you're trying to hide from a truth, I encourage you, just as I'm encouraging myself, this particular topic, I'm talking to myself as much as I'm talking to you. Let's jump in. Let's be vulnerable and let's just do it. I hope that this has given you some things to think about as well, and good luck. I hope that you embrace being truthful and feeling that vulnerability, just like I hope that I will also do the same. Thanks for joining. Bye.